The candle in Elena Whitmore's hand trembled, though the night was warm. Somewhere beyond the tall windows of Ravenscroft Hall, an owl called once and fell silent, as if even the birds knew something was wrong in this house tonight. She had been a bride for 6 hours. She had been afraid for longer than that. The wedding had ended at sunset, with bells ringing across the village, and villagers throwing petals along the stone path to the chapel doors. Elena had worn her mother's old lace veil, mended twice, because there had been no money for a new one. She had walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and her father had wept, not from joy, but from relief. The Whitmore family owed more than they could ever repay, and the Duke of Ravenscroft had offered to erase every debt in exchange for a wife. Elena had not loved Alistair Ravenscroft. She had barely known him, but she had looked into his tired gray eyes at the altar, and told herself that kindness could grow where love had not yet been planted. He had smiled at her once, briefly, like a man remembering how smiling worked. It was the only warmth she had seen from him all day. Now she sat alone, in the Duchess's chamber, waiting for her husband to come to her, and the candle would not stop shaking in her hand. A knock came at the door, sharp and impatient. Elena rose too quickly, nearly extinguishing the flame. "Enter," she said, and her voice sounded braver than she felt. It was not Alistair. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, her face the color of old paper, her hands twisting the apron at her waist, as though she meant to tear it apart. "Your Grace," the older woman said, and stopped. Elena had never been called that before. It landed strangely on her ears, like a coat that did not yet fit. "What is it, Mrs. Pruitt? Has something happened?" "It's the Duke, Your Grace. You must come. Please, you must come now." Elena did not wait to ask another question. She followed the housekeeper down the long gallery, past portraits of Ravenscroft ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to watch her hurry beneath them, down the curving stone staircase, and toward the study at the end of the west corridor, where a thin line of candlelight spilled beneath the closed door. 2 footmen stood outside it, pale and silent. One of them would not meet her eyes. "He has not answered," Mrs. Pruitt whispered. "Dr. Ashford has been sent for, but I fear—" Elena did not let her finish. She pushed the door open herself. Alistair Ravenscroft, 6th Duke of Ravenscroft, lay slumped across his own writing desk, one hand still curled around an overturned glass of brandy, his face turned toward the window as though he had been looking for something in the dark garden beyond it. The candles around him had burned low. A single sheet of paper lay beneath his outstretched fingers. The ink smudged where his hand had dragged across it. He was not breathing. Elena's first sound was not a scream. It was something quieter and more terrible, a small broken breath that seemed to come from somewhere beneath her ribs. She crossed the room on legs that did not feel like her own, and touched his shoulder, as though her touch alone might undo what had already been done. "Alistair," she said. "Alistair, please." He did not answer, because the dead do not answer, and some distant part of her mind understood this, even as the rest of her refused it. Dr. Ashford arrived within the half-hour, his coat still buttoned wrong from being woken in haste. He examined the Duke with the careful, unhurried hands of a man who had seen death many times before, and when he straightened, his face carried the particular stillness of someone about to say something no one wished to hear. "His heart," the doctor said quietly. "It has simply stopped. These things happen, Your Grace, more often than we like to admit, in men who carried great burdens." Elena stood at the edge of the room, her wedding dress still laced tight at her back, her mother's veil still pinned in her hair, and stared at the husband she had married that very morning and would now bury within the week. She did not cry, not yet. The shock had wrapped itself around her like a second skin, holding everything in. It was only when she turned toward the door that she saw him. Cassian Ravenscroft stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, watching the room with an expression Elena could not read. He was younger than his brother by 4 years, but stood taller, broader through the shoulders, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his brow and eyes, the color of a winter sea. He had attended the wedding that morning, dressed in unrelenting black, as though he had known, somehow, that mourning clothes would suit the day better than wedding finery. He did not rush to his brother's side. He did not weep or cry out. He simply looked at the dead man, slumped across the desk, and then he looked at Elena, and something passed behind his eyes that she would spend many nights afterward trying to name. It was not grief, Not entirely. It was something colder and more calculating. Though beneath it, buried deep, she thought she glimpsed something that might have been pain. "Well," Cassian said, and his voice was low and even, utterly unlike a man who had just lost his brother. "It seems the wedding night has ended rather differently than anyone planned." Mrs. Pruitt gasped at the coldness of it. Elena only stared at him, too stunned to feel the sting of his words. "Your brother is dead," she said, as though he might not have understood. "I have eyes, madam." Cassian stepped further into the room, and his gaze swept over the desk, the overturned glass, the smudged paper beneath Alistair's hand, with a sharpness that seemed almost professional, almost practiced, as if he were reading a ledger rather than a death. "Dr. Ashford, what killed him?" "His heart, my lord. It appears he simply—" "Appears," Cassian repeated softly, and something in the way he said the word made Elena's skin prickle. He did not finish the thought. Instead, he reached out and, with 2 fingers, carefully turned the smudged paper beneath his brother's hand so that he might read it, and whatever he saw there made his jaw tighten before he folded it once and slid it into his coat before anyone else could see. "My lord," Dr. Ashford said carefully, "perhaps that should remain." "It will remain with me," Cassian said, in a tone that ended the conversation entirely. Elena watched him with a growing unease she could not explain. She was a widow of 6 hours, standing in a room with a dead man and a living one, and the living one frightened her more than the dead ever could. The household did not sleep that night. Servants moved through the halls in hushed disbelief. Candles were lit in every window, as though light alone could push back what had happened. And somewhere in the depths of the house, someone was weeping, though Elena could not tell who. She sat in the Duchess's chamber, the room that had been prepared for her wedding night, and stared at the bed she had been meant to share with a husband, who was now laid out cold in the chapel below. Her mother's veil lay discarded on the chair beside her, and for the first time since she had heard Mrs. Pruitt's frightened knock, the tears came, hot and sudden and impossible to stop. She wept not only for Alistair, though she grieved for him, a man she had barely begun to know. She wept for her father's debts, which she had believed were finally settled, and which now hung over her family once more, like a blade waiting to fall. She wept for the life she had imagined, however uncertain, and for the strange, sudden loneliness of finding herself a widow before she had ever truly been a wife. A soft sound at the door made her look up. She expected Mrs. Pruitt, come to check on her, or perhaps her own mother, sent for in haste from the village. Instead, Cassian stood in the doorway once more, his black coat still buttoned, his expression unreadable in the low candlelight. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely sorry. "I wished to see that you were well." "Well," Elena repeated, wiping quickly at her face. "My husband died before our wedding night began, my lord. I am not certain wellness is within my reach tonight." Something flickered across his face, there, and gone too quickly for her to name it. He stepped into the room, though he kept a careful distance, as though he understood that grief required space. "You did not know him," Cassian said. "It was not a question. I knew him well enough to marry him. That is not the same thing." He moved to the window, looking out over the dark garden below, the very garden Alistair had perhaps been watching in his final moments. "My brother was not an easy man to know, Miss Whitmore. Forgive me, Your Grace." The title still sat strangely on her, especially spoken in his low, careful voice. "You do not sound as though you mourn him greatly, my lord." He turned to look at her then, and for a moment his composure cracked, just enough for her to see something raw beneath it. "I have mourned my brother for a great many years, Your Grace, in a great many ways. His death tonight is simply the last of them." She did not understand what he meant, not fully, though the words settled into her chest like stones. There was history here, old and unspoken, between these brothers, and she had married into the middle of it, without ever knowing the shape of what she had inherited. "What was on the paper?" she asked suddenly. "The one you took from beneath his hand." Cassian's expression closed like a door. "Nothing that concerns you tonight. He was my husband." "For 6 hours," Cassian said, and though his voice was not cruel, the words landed like a blow. "Grieve him if you wish, Your Grace. You are entitled to that. But do not pretend to acclaim on his secrets that even I, his own brother, have only begun to understand." He left her then, without another word, and Elena sat alone in the dark, dressed still in the remnants of her wedding finery, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She did not know, not yet, that this was only the beginning of the strange and dangerous path her life had just taken. She did not know that the paper he had hidden in his coat held a debt large enough to ruin the entire Ravenscroft name, or that somewhere in the village beyond the estate walls, a man named Baron Thorn was already smiling into his own glass of brandy, satisfied that the first part of his plan had gone exactly as he intended. She knew only that she was a widow before she had ever been a wife, that the house around her held more secrets than sorrow, and that the Duke's brother, with his cold eyes and colder words, frightened her in a way she could not yet explain, though not, perhaps, entirely because of cruelty. Outside, the owl called again, and this time, no one answered it either. The following morning brought gray skies and grayer faces. Elena woke in the Duchess's chamber, still in her wedding dress because she had been too exhausted and too heartbroken to summon her maid the night before, and for one confused moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned, all at once, like a wave breaking over her, and she pressed both hands to her face and allowed herself 3 long breaths before she rose. Her lady's maid, a gentle young woman named Margaret, helped her into mourning black without a single word about the strangeness of a bride wearing widow's clothes, on what should have been the second morning of her marriage. Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed too, and Elena understood that grief in this house was not hers alone. The servants had loved Alistair, in their own quiet way, whatever his brother's cold words the night before had suggested. Downstairs, the house had already begun preparing for mourning. Black cloth was being draped over mirrors and portraits, a task Elena found strangely comforting, as though the house itself understood that some things should not be looked at too closely in a time of grief. She found her mother waiting in the drawing room, having ridden through the night from the village upon hearing the news, and the 2 women embraced without speaking, because there was nothing yet that could be said. It was there, in the drawing room, that Elena first saw Baron Thorn. He was announced by the butler with the particular hesitancy of a servant unsure whether a guest ought to be admitted at all, given the circumstances. Baron Edmund Thorn was a tall man, elegant in his dress, with a face handsome enough to be trusted, and eyes sharp enough that Elena instinctively did not trust it. He offered his condolences, in a voice as smooth as poured honey, bowed over her hand, a moment longer than was proper, and expressed, with great sorrow, what a terrible loss this was for the entire county. "I understand you were a friend of my husband's," Elena said carefully. "An old friend," Thorn agreed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We had business together, Your Grace, of a delicate nature. I confess I had hoped to speak with him again before." He paused, as though overcome, though Elena thought the pause seemed rehearsed. "Well, before this tragedy. I wonder if he left any word for me. Any letter, perhaps." Something in the careful casualness of the question made Elena's skin prickle, much as Cassian's words had the night before. "I know of no letter, my lord. Perhaps you should ask his brother." Thorn's smile thinned, just slightly. "Ah, Cassian. Yes, I imagine he has already made himself quite comfortable in his brother's affairs." He left soon after, with more condolences and another lingering bow over her hand, and Elena stood in the drawing room afterward, feeling as though a cold wind had passed through, despite the fire burning in the hearth. She found Cassian later that afternoon in the estate's library, a room lined floor to ceiling with old leather-bound books and lit by tall windows that let in the pale gray light of the overcast sky. He sat at a small writing table near the window, the very paper he had taken from his brother's desk spread before him, along with several other documents Elena did not recognize. "Baron Thorn came to call," she said from the doorway. Cassian's head lifted sharply. What did he want? "A letter," he said. "One your brother might have left for him." She stepped further into the room. "You know him?" "I know of him." Cassian's jaw tightened, and he began gathering the papers before him with quick, careful movements, as though he did not wish her to see them. "He is not a man to be trusted, Your Grace, and I would ask that you avoid his company in future. You ask a great deal for a man who told me last night that his brother's secrets did not concern me." Something almost like respect flickered across Cassian's face at that, quickly hidden. "You are sharper than my brother gave you credit for, in the letters he wrote before your wedding." Elena's breath caught. "He wrote about me?" "He wrote that you were pretty and biddable, and would ask no difficult questions. Cassian's mouth curved, not quite a smile. It seems he was wrong on at least one count. She did not know whether to be insulted or oddly pleased, and the confusion of it left her silent for a long moment. Cassian studied her across the small distance of the library, his winter sea eyes unreadable once more, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier coldness. Your Grace, I will not pretend that my brother's death does not leave this family, and this house, in a position of considerable danger. There are debts. There are men like Thorn, circling already like crows over a battlefield. I would ask that you trust me, though I understand you have little reason to. You have given me little reason to, Elena said honestly. Cassian's expression flickered, something almost like the ghost of amusement passing through the coldness. No, I suppose I have not. He rose from the table, tucking the papers into a locked drawer with a small brass key. He then slid into his coat pocket. But I would ask you to consider, Your Grace, that the wedding night you were promised may not be entirely lost, only delayed. Elena did not understand what he meant. Not fully, not yet. But something in the careful weight of his words settled over her like the first cold drop of a coming storm, and she left the library that afternoon with the distinct and unsettling sense that her husband's death was not the end of the danger in this house, but only its beginning. That evening, as the sun set behind gray clouds and the household lit its first morning candles, Elena stood once more at the window of the Duchess's chamber and looked down at the garden where Alistair had perhaps spent his last living moments staring into the dark. She thought of Baron Thorn's smooth, dishonest smile. She thought of the locked drawer and the hidden papers. And she thought, though she was ashamed of the thought even as it formed, of Cassian Ravenscroft's cold winter eyes, and the strange, unwanted warmth that had stirred in her chest when he had, for one brief moment, looked at her as though she were not merely biddable and pretty, but someone worth truly seeing. She did not yet know that within the week she would be asked to marry him. She did not yet know how much of her life had already been decided by men she had never chosen, in rooms she had never entered, over debts she had never made. But she knew, standing there in the fading light, that the house of Ravenscroft held more danger than sorrow, and that she would need to be far cleverer than anyone in this house yet believed her to be, if she meant to survive what was still to come. The funeral of Alistair Ravenscroft, 6th Duke of Ravenscroft, took place 3 days later. Beneath a sky the color of wet slate, Elena stood at the edge of the family plot in her borrowed mourning veil, her mother's hand tight around her own, and watched as the coffin was lowered into ground that had swallowed 5 generations of Ravenscroft men before him. The village had turned out in full, drawn as much by curiosity as by grief. For a duke who dies on his wedding night is the sort of story that travels fast and far. Cassian stood on the opposite side of the grave, dressed in unrelenting black, his face carved from stone. He did not weep. He did not bow his head in prayer with the rest of the mourners. He simply watched the coffin descend, with an expression Elena had come to recognize over these past few days, a kind of controlled and terrible stillness, as though he were holding something enormous behind a very thin wall. When the ceremony ended, and the crowd began to disperse toward the waiting carriages, Elena found herself briefly alone at the graveside, the fresh earth dark and damp before her. She did not know what she had expected to feel, standing here. Grief, certainly, but beneath it, unwelcome and shameful, was something closer to fear, the sense that the ground itself had shifted beneath her, and she did not yet know where she would land. You did not know him, a voice said behind her, echoing words spoken days before, though this time, it was not Cassian who spoke them. She turned to find Baron Thorn standing a respectful distance away, his black coat immaculate, his expression arranged into careful sorrow. Forgive me, Your Grace. That was unkind. Grief makes strange observers of us all. What do you want, my lord? Thorn's smile flickered, surprised perhaps by her directness. Only to offer my continued condolences, and my continued friendship, should you find yourself in need of either in the difficult days ahead. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence. Your husband's affairs were more complicated than perhaps you understand, Your Grace. If you find yourself troubled by matters you do not fully comprehend, I hope you will think of me as an ally, rather than a stranger. What sort of matters, my lord? But Thorn only smiled again, bowed, and took his leave before she could press him further, leaving her standing alone, once more, amid the fresh grave and the gray morning, with the distinct and uncomfortable sense that she had just been offered a hand she would be wise not to take. The reading of the will took place the following afternoon, in the great hall of Ravenscroft Hall, before the family solicitor, a thin and careful man named Mr. Aldridge, who had served the Ravenscroft family for 30 years, and clearly wished he were anywhere else in the world that day. Elena sat beside her mother, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Cassian sat across the long table, alone, his expression unreadable. Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat and began to read, his voice dry and measured, moving through the customary language of legal documents until he reached the section that mattered. The dukedom, and the majority of the Ravenscroft estate, passed to Cassian Ravenscroft as the only surviving male heir. This much was expected, and Elena watched Cassian's face for some flicker of triumph or relief, but saw only the same careful stillness as before. It was the second portion of the will that changed everything. Alistair had specified, in language that suggested he had drafted these terms not long before the wedding itself, that his widow would retain her title as Duchess, along with a considerable portion of the estate's income and the deed to a smaller property called Ashwood Manor, unless she chose to remarry outside the Ravenscroft family, in which case the property and income would revert entirely to the estate. Should she remarry within the family, however, meaning to Cassian himself, the two portions of the inheritance would be reunited, and the estate would pass whole and unencumbered to their shared line. The great hall fell utterly silent. Elena stared at Mr. Aldridge, as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue. "I do not understand." "It means, Your Grace," the solicitor said carefully, not meeting her eyes, "that your late husband structured his will to strongly encourage a marriage between yourself and his brother, should the need arise. Whether he anticipated his own early death, I cannot say. But the terms are quite clear." Elena turned to look at Cassian, expecting to find him as stunned as she felt. Instead, she found him watching her, with an expression of careful, calculating thought, as though he had already begun working through the implications of what had just been read, and had arrived somewhere she had not yet reached. "My brother," Cassian said slowly, "always did enjoy binding people to his will, even from the grave." "You knew of this?" Elena asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I did not." His eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "But I confess, I am not entirely surprised by it." After Mr. Aldridge had gathered his papers and departed, and Elena's mother had been led away by Mrs. Pruitt to rest after the strain of the reading, Elena remained in the great hall with Cassian, the two of them alone beneath the tall windows and the watching portraits of dead Ravenscrofts. "You understand what this means," Cassian said finally. "Without Ashwood Manor, and your portion of the income restored to the estate, I inherit a title with considerably diminished resources. There are debts, Your Grace, debts my brother incurred, that I have only begun to fully understand. Debts to men like Baron Thorn. So this is what he wanted from me at the graveside," Elena said, half to herself. "He knows of the will." "Undoubtedly." Cassian's jaw tightened. "Thorn has held paper against this family for years, Your Grace. Gambling debts, mostly, though I suspect there is more beneath the surface I have not yet uncovered. If the estate cannot be made whole, he will have grounds to press his claims in ways that could ruin what remains of the Ravenscroft name." Elena studied him carefully. "You are telling me this so that I will understand why you require the marriage." Something almost like respect crossed his face again, the second time she had seen it in as many days. "I am telling you the truth, Your Grace, because I do not believe you are the sort of woman who responds well to being managed. My brother thought you biddable. I think he was mistaken, and I do not intend to make the same error. That is not an answer to whether you intend to ask me." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his winter eyes searching her face, as though trying to read something written there in a language he had only begun to learn. "No," he said finally. "I do not intend to ask you today. You have buried a husband 3 days ago, Your Grace. I will not add insult to that grief by proposing marriage over his fresh grave, whatever the will demands." It was, Elena thought, the kindest thing he had said to her since the night his brother died, and it unsettled her more than his coldness ever had, because it suggested a man capable of gentleness beneath all that careful, ruthless calculation, a man who might be far more dangerous to her heart than to her fortune. The days that followed settled into a strange and uneasy rhythm. Elena remained at Ravenscroft Hall, uncertain where else she might go, uncertain what her place in this house even was now. Widow and duchess and stranger all at once. She spent her mornings with her mother, who fretted constantly about the family's finances, and pressed Elena, gently but insistently, to consider what the will's terms might mean for all of them if she refused Cassian's eventual proposal. "Your father's debts were forgiven upon your marriage to Alistair," her mother reminded her one gray morning, over tea that had gone cold. "But if you remarry outside the family, and the estate reverts, I do not know if that forgiveness holds, Elena. I do not know what becomes of us. I cannot marry a man simply to save us from ruin a second time, mother. You did it once already, and found him kind enough, in his way. Alistair was different." Elena stared into her cold tea, unable to explain even to herself why the thought of marrying Cassian felt so much more perilous than marrying his brother had. Perhaps it was simply that Alistair had been a stranger entirely, a name and a title and nothing more, while Cassian had become, in these strange few days, someone she had begun, against all reason, to actually know. She spent her afternoons walking the estate grounds, partly for the fresh air, and partly because the house itself had begun to feel too full of watching eyes, painted and living both. It was on one such afternoon, walking the edge of the ornamental lake behind the house, that she came upon Cassian himself, standing alone at the water's edge, his coat discarded on a nearby bench, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, as though he had been doing something more physical than a duke usually did. "Your Grace," he said, straightening at her approach. "Forgive my appearance. I did not expect company." "What were you doing?" she asked, curious despite herself, for there was mud on his boots, and his dark hair had fallen loose across his forehead, in a way that made him look younger, less carved from stone. "Repairing the old boathouse door," he admitted, with something that might almost have been embarrassment. "It has hung crooked since I was a boy, and no one has ever thought it worth the trouble to fix. I suppose I had time on my hands today, and old habits are difficult to break." Elena studied him, this unexpected glimpse of a man who fixed doors with his own hands, rather than simply ordering a servant to do it, and felt something in her carefully guarded suspicion of him begin, just slightly, to loosen. "I did not think dukes concerned themselves with boathouse doors. I was not always meant to be a duke," Cassian said, and something in his voice grew quieter, more careful. "For most of my life, I was simply the second son, free to concern myself with whatever I pleased, boathouses included. It is strange, Your Grace, to have a title thrust upon you by a death you did not want, and to find yourself suddenly responsible for things you never asked to carry. I understand that feeling rather well," Elena said softly, "though my title came with rather less warning than yours." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the ornamental lake rippling quietly beside them, the gray afternoon light softening the hard lines of his face into something almost gentle. It was Cassian who broke the silence first, clearing his throat and reaching for his discarded coat. "I owe you an apology, Your Grace, for the night my brother died. I spoke to you with a coldness you did not deserve, whatever the circumstances." "You were grieving," Elena said, "in your own way." "Perhaps." He shrugged into his coat, his expression closing once more, though not entirely, not the way it had before. "I have never been skilled at showing grief the way others expect it to be shown. My father died when I was young enough that I do not remember him well, and my mother taught me early that a Ravenscroft man does not weep where others can see him do it. I fear it left me rather poorly equipped for moments such as these." It was, Elena realized, the most honest thing he had said to her yet, and it settled something quietly warm in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for, and did not entirely trust. She thought of Baron Thorne's smooth, dishonest smile at the graveside, and Cassian's rough, honest hands, still smudged with mud from a boathouse door no one had asked him to fix, and found herself, against every careful instinct she possessed, beginning to wonder which brother she had truly lost, and which one she might yet come to know. "I should return to the house," she said finally, though she made no immediate move to do so. "My mother will wonder where I have gone." "Of course," Cassian bowed, formal once more, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Your Grace, I meant what I said in the Great Hall. I will not press you toward a decision you are not ready to make, whatever the will demands, whatever danger Thorne represents. You have already given more to this family than any of us had the right to ask." Elena left him there at the water's edge, walking back toward the great gray house with her thoughts in more disorder than they had been in days. She did not know, walking those quiet garden paths, that Baron Thorn had already sent a letter that very morning to a solicitor of his own, quietly setting in motion a plan that would force Cassian's hand far sooner than either of them expected. She did not know that within a fortnight she would stand once more before an altar, though this time with far less ceremony and far more uncertainty in her heart. She knew only that the man she had feared on the night of her husband's death had shown her, this quiet gray afternoon, an unexpected glimpse of gentleness beneath the ruthlessness, and that she was no longer entirely certain which one of them, in the end, she ought to be more afraid of, him or her own uncertain heart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse had been pushed hard enough to lather, and Elena knew, before she even broke the seal, that whatever news it carried would not be good. It was addressed to Cassian, but Mrs. Pruitt, flustered and uncertain, had brought it first to Elena, uncertain of the household's proper order now that so much had changed so quickly. She found Cassian in the estate office, bent over a set of ledgers that had clearly kept him awake past a reasonable hour, judging by the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression must have warned him, because he set down his pen at once. "What is it?" "A letter, from a solicitor's office in London." She held it out to him. "The seal is one I do not recognize." Cassian broke the seal and read in silence, his jaw tightening with each line, until by the time he finished, his hand had curled into a fist around the paper's edge, crumpling it slightly, before he seemed to catch himself and smooth it flat again against the desk. "Thorn," he said, and the single word carried more fury than Elena had yet heard from him. "He has filed a claim against the estate, citing a gambling debt my brother incurred 2 years past. A debt secured, he claims, against a portion of the estate's land holdings. If the claim is upheld, it will strip us of nearly a third of what remains. Can he do this? He can attempt it, certainly. Whether the courts will uphold it depends a great deal on the paperwork my brother signed, and on how quickly I can counter it with resources of my own." Cassian rubbed a hand across his face, and for the first time since Elena had known him, he looked genuinely tired, the careful control slipping just slightly at the edges. "Which brings us back, Your Grace, to the matter of the will." Elena sat slowly in the chair across from his desk. "You are saying you need Ashwood Manor's income restored to the estate now, not eventually, now. I am saying that without it, I am not certain the estate survives Thorn's claim intact, and if it does not, your own portion of the inheritance may well be swallowed along with everything else, whether you remain unmarried to me or not." He met her eyes steadily. "I would not ask this of you if there were another way, Your Grace. I have spent the last several nights searching for one. And you found none. None that would resolve matters quickly enough to counter Thorn before his claim reaches the courts." Elena rose and walked to the window, looking out over the same gray garden where, days before, she had found him fixing a boathouse door with his own hands. She thought of her mother's worried face over cold tea, of her father's forgiven debts that might yet come due again, of Baron Thorn's smooth, dishonest smile at the graveside. And she thought, too, of the strange, unwanted warmth that had settled in her chest that quiet afternoon by the lake, when Cassian Ravenscroft had spoken to her, not as a duke managing an inconvenient widow, but as a man confessing his own uncertain grief. "If I agree," she said finally, without turning from the window, "I will not be managed, my lord, not by you, not by Thorn, not by anyone. I have been arranged into one marriage already, without my full understanding of what I was agreeing to. I will not enter a second blindly. I would not ask it of you." Cassian's voice had gone quiet behind her. "Whatever else you believe of me, Your Grace, I do not wish to make of you a second version of what my brother made of you the first time." She turned to face him then, studying his face for any sign of the ruthless calculation she had first seen the night his brother died, the coldness that had made her fear him more than she feared her own grief. She found, instead, only a kind of careful, weary honesty, a man asking for something he needed and did not feel entitled to demand. "I will need time to consider it," she said. "You shall have it, though I fear, Your Grace, that Thorn will not grant us a great deal of it to work with." He was, as it turned out, entirely correct. 2 days later, Baron Thorn himself called at Ravenscroft Hall, unannounced and uninvited, though Cassian received him in the study, with a courtesy so precise it bordered on menace. Elena, uncertain whether her presence would help or hinder matters, chose to remain in the corridor outside, close enough to hear the low murmur of voices through the partially closed door. "You must understand, Ravenscroft," Thorn was saying, his honeyed voice carrying easily, "that I take no pleasure in pressing this claim. Your brother and I had a long acquaintance, and I considered him a friend. Whatever difficulties arose between us regarding certain debts." "You considered him a source of easy money," Cassian's voice replied, flat and cold, "and now that he is dead and cannot dispute your terms, you consider me the same. A harsh assessment." Thorn did not sound offended. If anything, Elena thought she could hear amusement threaded through his words. "Though I will admit, the timing of your brother's death was rather convenient for certain of his creditors. One wonders whether the physician's diagnosis was entirely thorough." There was a long, dangerous silence. "What are you suggesting?" Cassian's voice had gone very quiet, and Elena, listening from the corridor, felt a chill move through her at the sound of it. "I suggest nothing, my lord. I merely observe that grief makes strange bedfellows of convenience and coincidence." A pause, the sound of a chair shifting. "Settle the debt, Ravenscroft, in full, within the fortnight, or I shall be forced to press my claim through the courts, where I suspect certain questions about your brother's final hours might arise that neither of us would find comfortable to answer." She stepped away from the door, her heart pounding, Thorn's veiled suggestion echoing in her mind. Was he implying that Alistair's death had not been natural after all? And if so, did he believe Cassian responsible, or was this simply another manipulation, another thread in whatever careful trap he was weaving around this family? She was still standing in the corridor, lost in troubled thought, when the study door opened and Thorn emerged, straightening his gloves with the satisfied air of a man who had gotten exactly what he came for. He paused when he saw her, his smile returning at once. "Your Grace." "A pleasure, as always." He bowed over her hand, and this time Elena did not resist the urge to withdraw it quickly. "I do hope the household finds its way through these difficult days, though I fear, given certain conversations I have just had, that the difficulties may be only beginning." He left without further explanation, and Elena entered the study, to find Cassian standing at the window, his back rigid, his hands clasped tightly behind him. "What did he mean?" she asked. "About Alistair's death." When he finally did, his face had settled back into that careful, controlled stillness she had first seen the night his brother died, and it frightened her more now than it had then, because now she understood that beneath it lay not coldness, but a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "He means to suggest that I had motive to see my brother dead," Cassian said quietly, "that I benefited from his death, and therefore might have hastened it." "Did you?" The question left her before she could stop it, and she saw it land, saw something flicker across his face that might have been hurt. "No," he said simply. "Whatever else you believe of me, Your Grace, I did not kill my brother. But I confess, I do not know how to prove a negative to a man determined to see guilt where none exists, particularly when that man has every incentive to keep me too occupied, defending my own name to properly defend the estate from his claims." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the careful honesty she had come to recognize in him these past days, against the memory of his rough hands fixing a boathouse door, against the quiet grief she had glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior at his brother's graveside. "I believe you," she said finally, and meant it. Something in Cassian's shoulders eased, just slightly, at her words, though his expression remained guarded. "Thank you, Your Grace. That is more than I expected, and rather more than I deserve, given how little I have done to earn your trust." "You have done more than you realize." Elena moved closer, drawn by an instinct she did not entirely understand. "But we must decide, my lord, and quickly, what to do about Thorn. If he means to press this claim through the courts, and to raise questions about your brother's death in the process, then delay serves no one but him." Cassian's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the same careful calculation she had first feared, though now she understood it differently, not as ruthlessness for its own sake, but as a man doing what he must to protect what remained of his family, however imperfectly. "Are you saying you have decided, Your Grace?" Elena took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her, the strange, uncertain path her life had taken, since the night she had walked down the aisle in her mother's mended veil. I am saying that Baron Thorn has given us little choice, and that I would rather face whatever comes next as your wife, my lord, with full knowledge of the danger before us, than as a widow, left unprotected and uncertain, in a house full of secrets. That is not the same as saying you wish to marry me. No, Elena admitted, a faint and unexpected smile touching her lips despite the gravity of the moment. It is not. But it is, I think, as close to an honest answer as either of us is likely to get today. Cassian studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, the careful stillness giving way, just briefly, to something warmer, something that might almost have been hope. Then I will take it, your grace, and be grateful for it, whatever comes. Outside the study window, the gray afternoon had begun to clear, thin shafts of sunlight breaking through the clouds and falling across the garden where, not so long ago, Elena had found a duke fixing a crooked door with his own two hands. She did not know, standing there in the fading light of that difficult day, how much danger still lay ahead of them, how deep Baron Thorn's schemes truly ran, or how much of her own heart she had already, without quite realizing it, begun to surrender to the ruthless, unexpectedly gentle man standing before her. She knew only that a decision had been made, however uncertain, and that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. News of a second wedding at Ravenscroft Hall spread through the village faster than the first ever had, though this time the whispers carried a different flavor entirely. There were no bells rung in celebration, no petals thrown along the chapel path. Instead, there was gossip, murmured over market stalls and shared across garden fences, about a widow remarrying within the very same month she had buried her husband, and about the brother who had claimed her with what many considered unseemly haste. Elena heard none of it directly, but she saw its shadow in the careful, sideways glances of the servants, in the way conversations quieted when she entered a room, in her own mother's anxious insistence that they proceed quietly, without fanfare, lest the whispers grow louder still. It does not matter what the village says, Cassian told her, the evening before the ceremony, finding her alone in the library, where she had taken to spending her quiet hours since the day by the lake. What matters is that the estate survives Thorn's claim, and that you are protected within it. Gossip fades, debts do not. That is a rather practical way of viewing one's own wedding, my lord. Something flickered across his face, there and gone. I have found practicality serves better than sentiment, your grace, in matters where sentiment has already failed us once. Elena set down the book she had been pretending to read and studied him carefully. He stood near the tall windows, the last light of evening catching the sharp lines of his face, and she thought again of the strange contradiction he presented, ruthless calculation wrapped around something gentler that he seemed determined to keep hidden from view. You speak as though sentiment is a weakness, she said. I speak as though sentiment has cost this family a great deal already. His voice had gone quiet, careful. My brother married for duty, and called it affection, and died before he ever learned whether the affection might have become real. I do not intend to make the same mistake, your grace, of pretending toward feelings that circumstance alone has forced upon us. The words stung more than Elena expected, though she could not have said precisely why. She had told herself, these past days, that this second marriage was a matter of survival and nothing more. A practical arrangement to protect her family and his from Baron Thorn's schemes. And yet some small, unguarded part of her had begun to hope for something more, some echo of the warmth she had glimpsed by the lake, and Cassian's careful words closed that hope away as firmly as a locked door. Of course, she said, gathering her book and rising. Practicality. I understand perfectly, my lord. She left the library before he could see how deeply his words had landed, and if Cassian noticed the sudden coolness in her departure, he said nothing to call her back. The wedding, when it came, was a small and quiet affair, held not in the village chapel where she had married Alistair, but in the private chapel on the estate grounds itself, attended only by the household staff, Elena's mother and father, and Mr. Aldridge the solicitor, whose careful, measured presence lent the proceedings the feeling of a business transaction rather than a celebration, however much the vicar tried to soften the ceremony with kind words about second chances and new beginnings. Elena wore gray, not the white of her first wedding, nor the full black of mourning, a compromise her mother had suggested, and Elena had accepted without much argument, too exhausted by the whirlwind of the past fortnight to care greatly about the color of her dress. Cassian stood at the altar, in the same black coat he had worn to his brother's funeral, his expression carved from the same careful stillness she had come to recognize. Though when she reached his side, and their eyes met, she thought she glimpsed something warmer, flicker briefly beneath the surface, before he mastered it once more. The vows were spoken quickly, without embellishment. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Cassian did not kiss her, as custom dictated, but instead bowed formally over her hand, his lips brushing her knuckles with a gentleness that contradicted the coldness of the gesture's formality. And Elena found herself more unsettled by that small, careful kindness than she would have been by any grand display. The small gathering that followed in the great hall was subdued, conversation kept low and careful, as though everyone present understood that celebration would be unseemly given the circumstances. Elena's mother wept quietly with relief rather than joy, whispering to her daughter that the family's debts were safe now, truly safe, and Elena found she could not entirely resent the relief in her mother's voice, however much the reasoning behind this marriage weighed on her own heart. It was Cassian who found her later that evening, standing alone on the terrace, overlooking the same ornamental lake, where they had spoken so honestly weeks before. The night had turned cool, and Elena had wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, watching the moon's reflection ripple across the dark water. "You are cold," Cassian observed, though he made no move to offer his coat, and Elena wondered if he remembered, even now, to hold himself carefully apart from her. "I am thinking," she corrected. "There is a difference. May I ask what troubles you, on your wedding night, Your Grace?" A rather different wedding night than either of us expected to share, I imagine, when this year began. Elena turned to look at him, the moonlight softening the sharp angles of his face, and found herself, despite everything, wanting to be honest with him. "I am wondering, my lord, whether I have simply traded one arrangement of convenience for another, no better and no worse than the first, only with a groom who at least has the honesty to name it plainly." Something shifted in Cassian's expression, a flicker of something that might have been regret. "You believe I do not care for your well-being, beyond what the estate requires of me. I believe you have made it quite clear, my lord, that sentiment is a weakness you do not intend to indulge." I said that sentiment had cost this family a great deal. Cassian stepped closer, and Elena felt her breath catch at the sudden nearness of him, at the careful, searching way he studied her face in the moonlight. "I did not say that I felt nothing, Your Grace. Only that I did not trust myself to name it honestly. Not yet. Not when so much still stands between us unresolved, Thorne's claims and my brother's death chief among them." "Then name it dishonestly," Elena said softly, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I would rather an uncertain truth than a careful silence, my lord." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the gentle lapping of the lake below the terrace, the distant call of some night bird settling into the trees. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful control entirely, replaced by something rawer, more honest than she had yet heard from him. "I have watched you these past weeks navigate grief and danger and uncertainty with more courage than most men I have known, Your Grace, and I confess that somewhere in the watching, my careful practicality became rather more complicated than I intended it to be." His hand rose, hesitant, and brushed a stray curl from her cheek, the touch light as a whisper. "I do not know yet what to call this feeling, Elena, but I do not believe, any longer, that it is nothing." It was the first time he had used her given name, without title, without formality, and something in the sound of it, spoken so quietly in the moonlit dark, undid the careful composure Elena had maintained through this strange and uncertain day. She did not move away from his touch, and for a long moment, they simply stood there together on the terrace, the space between them charged with something neither of them was yet prepared to fully name. It was Cassian who stepped back first, clearing his throat, the careful control returning to his expression like a mask settling back into place. "Forgive me. It has been a long day, and I fear I have spoken more freely than propriety allows, on our wedding night of all occasions." "There is nothing to forgive," Elena said softly. "I asked for honesty, my lord. You have given it." "Cassian," he corrected quietly. If we are to be honest with one another, Your Grace, I would ask that you use my name, at least when we are alone. Cassian, then. The name felt strange and new on her tongue, and she saw something in his eyes warm slightly at the sound of it. And you may call me Elena, when we are alone. He nodded, a small, careful smile touching his lips. The first genuine smile she had seen from him since the day they met. Elena, I would ask that you retire soon. The night grows cold, and tomorrow brings its own difficulties. Thorn will not simply disappear because we have married. If anything, our union may provoke him further. I am not afraid of Baron Thorn, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. No, Cassian agreed, studying her with something that looked almost like admiration. I do not believe you are. Which is, perhaps, precisely why I find myself so unexpectedly grateful that circumstance brought you into this family. Elena, whatever grief and danger accompanied your arrival. They returned to the house together, walking side by side, rather than with the careful distance they had maintained before, and though Cassian did not join her in the Duchess's chamber that night, respecting whatever boundaries remained unspoken between them, Elena lay awake long into the darkness, replaying the sound of her own name in his voice, the gentle warmth of his touch against her cheek, and wondering, with a mixture of hope and fear she had not expected to feel on this strange and uncertain wedding night, whether the man she had married for practicality alone might yet become something far more dangerous to her heart than Baron Thorn could ever be to her fortune. Outside, the moon continued its slow arc across the sky, indifferent to the fragile new understanding forming within the walls of Ravenscroft Hall. And in the village beyond, Baron Thorn sat awake in his own study. A letter from his solicitor spread before him, already planning his next move against a marriage he had never expected, and certainly never intended, to succeed. The weeks that followed the wedding settled into a fragile rhythm, one Elena found herself, against all expectation, beginning to treasure. Cassian rose early each morning to work through the estate's ledgers, determined to shore up whatever defenses could be built against Thorn's looming claim, and Elena, finding herself with little else to occupy her days, began to assist him, her sharp mind proving more useful with figures and accounts than either of them had anticipated. You have a gift for this, Cassian remarked one morning, watching as she caught an error in a column of figures that had eluded him for the better part of an hour. My brother never had patience for ledgers. He preferred to leave such matters to stewards and solicitors.
My father was a merchant, Elena reminded him, before his debts overtook him.
I learned to read figures before I learned to read novels. Something in Cassian's expression softened at that, a kind of quiet respect that had been growing steadily between them these past weeks, alongside the careful warmth that neither of them had yet found the courage to name aloud again since that moonlit night on the terrace. They had settled into an easy companionship, working side by side through mornings of ledgers and afternoons of estate business, sharing meals that had grown steadily less formal and more genuine, and Elena found herself, more often than she wished to admit, watching him across the breakfast table and wondering what it might feel like if the careful distance between their chairs and between their hearts were finally closed. It was on one such morning, as they worked through the estate accounts together in the study, that Elena's eye caught on an entry that did not belong. Cassian, she said slowly, drawing his attention from his own papers. What is this? A payment, made 3 years past, to a solicitor's office in London, for a sum considerably larger than any other entry on this page. Cassian leaned over to examine the entry she indicated, his brow furrowing. I do not recognize it. This predates my brother's death by years. He traced the entry with one finger, his expression growing troubled. This is not my brother's handwriting, nor the steward's. I do not know who recorded this. Could it be connected to Thorn's claim? Perhaps? Cassian rose and moved to the locked drawer where he had kept the papers taken from his brother's desk the night of his death, retrieving the key from his coat pocket. He spread the recovered documents across the desk, comparing them carefully against the ledger entry, and Elena watched his face grow increasingly grim as he worked. What is it? She asked finally, unable to bear the silence. My brother's letter, Cassian said quietly. The one I took from beneath his hand the night he died. I have read it a dozen times since, and each time I understood only fragments, references to a debt, a threat, matters I could not fully piece together. But this ledger entry, This payment 3 years past. I believe I finally understand what it means." He turned the letter so she could read it herself, and Elena's eyes moved quickly over Alistair's smudged, hurried handwriting, the words growing more urgent and less controlled as the letter progressed, as though he had been writing in genuine fear. The letter spoke of a debt incurred years before Elena had ever known him, a gambling loss to Baron Thorn so substantial that Alistair had been forced to sign over rights to a portion of the estate's most valuable timberland as collateral, rights he had never disclosed to anyone, not even his own brother. But it was the final lines of the letter that made Elena's breath catch, for they spoke not of debt alone, but of threat, of Thorn's veiled suggestions that he possessed knowledge of some earlier scandal within the Ravenscroft family, one Alistair had spent years and considerable sums trying to keep buried, and that he would use that knowledge without hesitation if his claims upon the estate were ever disputed. "What scandal?" Elena asked. "What is he referring to?" Cassian's jaw had tightened into something hard and dangerous. "I do not know, but I intend to find out, before Thorn has the chance to use it against us." "Cassian." Elena set down the letter, studying his face carefully. "You said, the night your brother died, that you had mourned him for years, in a great many ways. What did you mean by that?" For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, his expression closing once more into that careful, guarded stillness she had learned to recognize as a wall he raised whenever a subject cut too close to something painful. But then, slowly, he sat down across from her, his shoulders sagging, with a weariness that seemed to reach far deeper than the events of these past weeks. "My brother and I were close once," he said quietly. "As boys, we were nearly inseparable. But as we grew, Alistair changed. He developed tastes for gambling, for risk, for the kind of dangerous excitement that our father had always warned against. I tried, for years, to steer him away from it, to protect him from men like Thorn who preyed on exactly that kind of weakness. I failed, more times than I succeeded, and each failure widened the distance between us, until by the time our father died and Alistair inherited the title, we had become little more than strangers, sharing a family name." "That is why you seemed so unmoved by his death," Elena said softly, understanding at last. "Not because you did not care, but because you had already grieved the loss of him, long before his heart ever stopped." "Yes." Cassian's voice had gone rough with an emotion he seemed determined not to fully release. "I grieved the brother I lost to his own recklessness for years, Elena, and I confess, I do not entirely know how to grieve the brother who finally, truly died, when so much of him had already been gone from me for so long." Elena reached across the desk without quite thinking, her hand covering his, and felt him go very still at the contact, though he did not pull away. "I am sorry," she said simply, "for both losses." "Thank you." Cassian turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers threading together with a naturalness that surprised them both. "I have not spoken of this to anyone, Elena, not even to my mother, before she passed. There is something about your presence that makes honesty feel less dangerous than I have always believed it to be." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of his confession settling gently between them, before the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor broke the moment entirely. Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway, her face pale with alarm. "Your Grace, my lord, forgive the interruption." "There is a man at the door, claiming urgent business regarding the estate's timber rights. He says his name is Mr. Silas Grant, and that he represents Baron Thorn's interests." Cassian rose at once, his hand slipping from Elena's as the careful, controlled Duke reasserted himself over the honest, grieving man she had glimpsed only moments before. "Show him to the study, Mrs. Pruitt. I will speak with him directly." Mr. Silas Grant proved to be a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, and the anxious manner of someone caught between two masters he feared equally. He presented documents, claiming that the timber rights mentioned in Alistair's hidden letter had, in fact, already been legally transferred to Baron Thorn years before, and that Thorn intended to begin harvesting the land within the month, well within his legal rights as the document's holder. "This is theft," Cassian said flatly, examining the papers with a fury he barely contained. "My brother was coerced into signing these under duress, threatened with the exposure of a scandal Thorn refuses even now to name." "I know nothing of duress, my lord," Mr. Grant said, wringing his ink-stained hands. "I know only that the documents are signed, witnessed, and legally binding." Baron Thorn asked me to deliver notice of his intent, and to inform you that further disputes regarding the timber rights, or regarding his other claims against the estate, would be most efficiently resolved through a private settlement rather than a public court proceeding, which he assures me neither party would find comfortable, given certain questions that might arise. The threat, though delivered secondhand through a nervous solicitor's clerk, landed with the same chilling weight as Thorn's own veiled words had weeks before. Cassian dismissed Mr. Grant with cold formality, and once the man had gone, scurrying from the study with visible relief at his escape, Cassian turned to Elena with an expression of grim determination. He means to bleed this estate dry, piece by piece, using whatever leverage he can find, real or fabricated, until there is nothing left to inherit, Cassian said. I will not allow it, Elena. Whatever scandal my brother tried so desperately to bury, I intend to uncover it myself, before Thorn can use it as a weapon against us. Then let me help you, Elena said at once. You have already seen that I have some skill with figures and accounts. Perhaps together we might uncover what your brother spent years hiding. Cassian studied her for a long moment, something warm and grateful moving behind his careful eyes. You would do that, knowing the danger it might bring? I married you knowing the danger already present in this house, Cassian. Elena rose and crossed to stand before him, closer than propriety strictly allowed, though neither of them stepped back. I do not intend to face the rest of it from a careful distance, watching from the safety of the drawing room, while you carry this burden alone. Something shifted in Cassian's expression, the careful control giving way once more to the raw honesty she had glimpsed moments before Mr. Grant's interruption, and for a moment, Elena thought he might close the remaining distance between them entirely. Instead, he reached up and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing softly against her skin. Elena, he said quietly, I begin to think that my brother's death, however great the tragedy, may have led me towards something I did not know I was searching for. Neither of them spoke further of it that evening. The mystery of Alistair's hidden scandal, and the threat of Thorn's next move, pressing too urgently against them, to allow for anything more than the fragile, unspoken understanding growing steadily between them. But as Elena retired that night, she found herself smiling faintly into the darkness, thinking not of Baron Thorn's dangerous schemes, but of the warmth in Cassian's touch, and the quiet, growing certainty that whatever else this strange marriage of necessity had become, it was no longer, for either of them, merely a matter of practicality alone. The search for the truth behind Alistair's hidden scandal began in earnest the following morning, though it proved far more difficult than either Elena or Cassian had anticipated. The late Duke had been careful, methodical even, in burying whatever secret Thorn held over him, and days of searching through old correspondence, estate records, and locked drawers yielded nothing but frustration and dust. It was Elena who finally found the thread worth pulling, tucked away in a box of old letters stored in the attic, letters written not by Alistair, but to their late mother, from a woman whose name Elena did not recognize, signed only with the initials E.M. Cassian, she called, her voice carrying down through the narrow attic stairs. Come and see this. He climbed the stairs quickly, brushing dust from his sleeves, as he emerged into the low-ceilinged attic space, lit only by the thin gray light filtering through a single small window. Elena held out the bundle of letters, her expression troubled. These are addressed to your mother, from someone signing herself only as E.M. They speak of a child, Cassian, a child born outside of marriage, and money sent quietly for years to ensure the matter remained private. Cassian took the letters with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady, reading quickly through the careful, guarded language of a correspondence clearly meant to remain hidden. His face grew paler with each letter, until finally, he set them down on an old trunk, staring at nothing for a long moment. My father, he said finally, his voice rough. These letters are dated from before my birth, Elena. If I am reading this correctly, my father fathered a child outside his marriage, to my mother, and paid for that child's silence, and the mother's, for years afterward. You believe this is the scandal Thorn holds over your family? It must be. Cassian's jaw tightened. If such a child exists, and could prove legitimate claim through blood, however illegitimate through law, the scandal alone would be devastating to the family name, and depending on the circumstances of the birth, There might even be grounds for legal complications regarding inheritance. My brother must have discovered this, somehow, and spent considerable sums trying to keep it buried, sums that likely contributed to the very debts Thorn now holds against us. Elena studied him carefully, watching the careful control war with something rawer beneath it. The shock of discovering a secret sibling he had never known existed, layered atop the older grief of the brother he had already lost in every way but the physical. Do you know who this EM might be? Or what became of the child? No. Cassian gathered the letters carefully, tucking them into his coat, with the same careful precision he had shown with his brother's hidden documents weeks before. But I intend to find out, before Thorn can use this against us, in ways I cannot yet predict. The search that followed took them beyond the walls of Ravenscroft Hall entirely, into the village records and, eventually, to a small cottage on the estate's eastern boundary, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Ellery Marsh had lived quietly for over 30 years, receiving a modest but steady income from the Ravenscroft estate that neither Cassian nor Elena had previously understood the reason behind. Mrs. Marsh received them cautiously, her sharp eyes studying Cassian's face with an intensity that made Elena wonder, even before the woman spoke, how much truth lay behind the old letters they had found. "You have your father's eyes," Mrs. Marsh said finally, once she had settled them both in her small, tidy parlor. "I wondered, when I heard of your brother's death, whether you would eventually come asking questions. I confess, I had hoped you might not need to." "Then the letters are true," Cassian said quietly. "You are the EM who corresponded with my mother." "I am." Mrs. Marsh's weathered hands folded carefully in her lap. "Your father and I were young once, my lord, before he married your mother, before duty and title separated what affection there was between us. When I found myself with child, your father did what he believed was honorable. Given the circumstances, he could not escape. He provided for us, quietly, for as long as he lived, and your mother, to her credit, continued the arrangement after his death, though I believe it cost her considerable pain to do so." "The child," Elena said gently, understanding the weight of what remained unspoken. "What became of them?" Mrs. Marsh's eyes grew distant with old sorrow. "My daughter, Grace, grew up in this cottage, knowing only that her father had been a gentleman who could not acknowledge her, but who had loved her in whatever quiet ways were available to him. She married some years past, a good man, a farmer from the next county, and has children of her own now. She knows the truth of her birth, my lord, but has never sought to claim anything from your family, beyond what was already quietly given." "Then how does Baron Thorn know of this?" Cassian asked, his brow furrowing. Mrs. Marsh's expression darkened. "Your brother, your Grace, God rest him, was not always as careful as his father in matters of discretion. He visited me some years past, in considerable distress, having discovered the old letters much as you have today. I believe, though I cannot say for certain, that he spoke of the matter while deep in his cups at some gambling establishment or another, and that Baron Thorn, who has never missed an opportunity to gather leverage against those he considers useful, took careful note of what he heard." The picture, at last, began to assemble itself fully in Elena's mind. Alistair, discovering his father's old secret and reacting with the same lack of discretion that had plagued so much of his life, had inadvertently handed Thorn the very weapon the Baron now wielded against the family. A threat not of legal claim, but of scandal. The public exposure of an old and painful family secret that could damage the Ravenscroft name, regardless of its legal irrelevance to the current inheritance. "Mrs. Marsh," Cassian said carefully, "I must ask, and I hope you will forgive the directness of the question. If Baron Thorn were to make this matter public, in an attempt to pressure my family, would you and your daughter be willing to speak plainly of the truth, that no claim upon the estate was ever sought or intended?" "I would do more than that, my lord," Mrs. Marsh said, a flash of old steel entering her gentle voice. "I loved your father, in my own quiet way, and I have no wish to see his memory used as a weapon by a man like Thorn, whom I have heard spoken of in this village, with no great affection. If it would help your family, I would speak the truth publicly myself, and gladly, whatever discomfort it might bring me." They left the cottage that afternoon, with considerably more understanding than they had arrived with, and considerably more hope as well, for Mrs. Marsh's willingness to speak openly removed much of the power behind Thorn's veiled threats. Walking back along the estate's eastern boundary toward the great house, Cassian was quiet for a long while, lost in thought.
"You are troubled," Elena observed, matching her pace to his.
I am thinking of my father, Cassian admitted, a man I remember only dimly, and wondering how much of what I believed about him was true, and how much was simply the careful story my mother chose to tell. I have a sister, Elena, one I never knew existed until today, and I find myself uncertain how to feel about that knowledge. You do not have to feel any particular way about it today, Elena said gently. Some truths take time to settle properly, before we understand what they mean to us. Cassian glanced at her, something warm and grateful moving behind his eyes. You have a gift for saying precisely what is needed, Elena, in whatever moment it is needed. I have simply had considerable practice, these past weeks, in learning to understand you, my lord. A faint smile touched her lips. It seemed only practical, given the circumstances of our marriage. Something in the echo of his own earlier words, spoken back to him with gentle teasing, made Cassian laugh, a genuine, unguarded sound Elena had not yet heard from him, and it transformed his face entirely, softening the careful lines that grief and responsibility had carved there. He reached for her hand as they walked, and this time neither of them hesitated or pulled away, their fingers threading together naturally as they made their way back toward the great gray house waiting at the end of the path. Thorn will not give up his claims easily, Cassian said finally, as the house came into view. Even with Mrs. Marsh's willingness to speak the truth, he still holds the matter of the timber rights, and whatever debts my brother's recklessness incurred beyond that. We have removed one weapon from his arsenal, Elena, but I fear the war is far from finished. Then we will face whatever comes next together, Elena said firmly, as we have faced everything since the night your brother died. Cassian stopped walking, turning to face her fully, the late afternoon sun catching the sharp planes of his face and softening them into something Elena had come to treasure, more than she had ever expected to, given the cold, calculating stranger she had first feared in the doorway of his brother's study. Together, he repeated softly, as though testing the weight and truth of the word. I confess, Elena, that I did not expect to find such comfort in that word, when this marriage began as nothing more than a practical necessity. Nor did I, Elena admitted, and yet here we are. He raised her hand to his lips then, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers, and though the gesture echoed the formal kiss he had offered on their wedding day, this time it carried none of the careful distance, none of the practiced formality. This time, it carried only warmth and hope, and the fragile, growing certainty that whatever barren thorn still had planned against them, they would face it, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two people who had begun, against every careful expectation either of them had carried into this marriage, to genuinely care for one another. They walked the rest of the way back to Ravenscroft Hall hand in hand, the great gray house waiting silent and watchful ahead of them, unaware that within its walls, and within the schemes of the dangerous man who still circled its fortunes, far greater dangers than old family secrets still lay in wait. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday evening, rolling in from the western hills with a suddenness that caught even the estate's oldest servants unprepared. Elena stood at the window of the Duchess's chamber, watching lightning split the darkening sky, the wind bending the old oak trees along the drive nearly double, and felt a strange kinship with the wildness of it, as though the weather outside had finally decided to match the turbulence that had defined these past weeks within. Since the visit to Mrs. Marsh's cottage, life at Ravenscroft Hall had settled into something Elena had not expected to find in a marriage born of necessity and danger, a genuine, growing partnership that extended well beyond the careful boundaries either of them had first established. Cassian no longer retreated behind cold formality when matters grew difficult. Elena no longer held herself apart, waiting for the practical arrangement to reveal its true, transactional nature. They had become, in the quiet accumulation of shared mornings over ledgers, and shared afternoons walking the estate grounds, something that felt increasingly like what a marriage ought to be, whatever uncertain circumstances had first brought them together. A knock at her door drew her attention from the storm outside. Cassian entered without waiting for her answer, his expression troubled. The eastern bridge has washed out, he said. One of the tenant families, the Hollises, are trapped on the far side of the stream, with the water rising. I mean to ride out with some of the men to bring them to safety before the storm worsens further. Then I am coming with you. Elena, the roads will be treacherous, and the rain. I have delivered children in worse conditions than this, helping the village midwife when I was younger," Elena said firmly, already reaching for her cloak. "The Hollis family has 3 young children, Cassian. If there is illness or injury among them once they are brought to safety, you will need someone who knows how to help, not simply someone who knows how to ride." Cassian studied her for a long moment, and Elena watched the familiar war play across his features, the instinct to protect warring, with the growing respect he had developed for her capability and courage these past weeks. Finally he nodded, something like pride flickering behind his eyes despite the gravity of the moment. "Very well. But you stay close to me, and you do exactly as I say, when I say it. This storm is not a matter to be taken lightly." The ride to the eastern bridge was every bit as treacherous as Cassian had warned, the rain coming down in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible, the wind tearing at their cloaks with vicious insistence. Elena rode close behind Cassian and the small party of estate men he had gathered, her horse skittish beneath her with every crack of thunder, but she held her seat firmly, refusing to give voice to the fear tightening in her chest. They found the Hollis family exactly where the messenger had reported, huddled in their small cottage, as the stream beside it continued to rise, the water already lapping at the cottage's lowest step. Mr. Hollis, a weathered tenant farmer, met them at the door with obvious relief. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Cassian with a respect that had grown considerably since Cassian's takeover of the estate and his careful attention to the tenants' well-being, a marked contrast, Elena suspected, from whatever neglect they had known under Alistair's more careless stewardship. "We feared no one would reach us before the water rose further. We are here now," Cassian said firmly. "Gather your family, quickly. We must cross the lower ford before it becomes impassable as well." The crossing proved every bit as dangerous as feared, the water rushing faster and higher than any of them had anticipated, and it was during this crossing, with the youngest Hollis child clutched carefully in Elena's arms, as her horse picked its way carefully through the rising water, that disaster nearly struck. A sudden surge of water, likely from some upstream collapse, sent her horse stumbling, and for one terrifying moment, Elena felt herself losing her balance entirely, the child in her arms crying out in fear. It was Cassian who reached her first, his own horse pressing close alongside hers, his strong arm wrapping around her waist to steady her even as he guided both horses carefully toward the far bank. "I have you," he said, his voice cutting through the storm's roar with fierce, unwavering certainty. "I have you, Elena. You are safe." They made it across without further incident, and once the entire Hollis family had been safely delivered to the shelter of a nearby tenant cottage on higher ground, the immediate danger passed. Elena found herself trembling, not entirely from the cold rain soaking through her cloak. "You are frightened," Cassian observed quietly, once the Hollis family had been settled, and the estate men had begun making arrangements to wait out the worst of the storm, before continuing back to the great house. "I am well," Elena said, though her voice wavered slightly. "It was simply a difficult crossing." Cassian studied her for a long moment, and then, without further words, he drew her into his arms, holding her close against the storm, still raging outside the small shelter, where they had taken refuge. Elena did not resist, sinking gratefully into the warmth and solid strength of him, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, so different from the wild chaos of the storm outside. "I confess," Cassian said quietly, his voice rumbling gently beneath her ear, "that when I saw your horse stumble in that current, I have never in my life known such fear. Not even the night my brother died did I feel my chest constrict so completely." Elena tilted her head back to look up at him, startled by the rawness in his voice. "Cassian, let me finish," he said softly, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek with a tenderness that stole the breath from her lungs. "I told myself, when this marriage began, that I would guard my heart carefully, that I would not repeat whatever mistake my brother made in confusing duty for genuine affection. I have failed rather spectacularly at that intention, Elena. I do not know precisely when it happened, whether it was the afternoon by the lake, or the night I finally spoke your given name, or simply the slow accumulation of every morning spent working beside you through the estate's troubles. But I know, standing here now, with the memory of your horse stumbling in that current still fresh enough to make my hands shake, that I love you. Entirely, and rather more helplessly than I ever intended to allow." The words settled over Elena like warmth after the storm's cold rain, and she felt her own eyes fill with sudden tears, not of fear now, but of something far gentler, and more overwhelming. "Cassian," she said softly, "I have been waiting weeks to hear you say something honest about your heart, without hiding behind practicality or careful distance." "Is that a yes?" he asked, a faint, hopeful smile touching his lips despite the gravity that had preceded it. "To the sentiment, I mean, whatever careful weakness I once believed it to be, it is a yes," Elena confirmed, reaching up to cup his rain-damp face in her hands. "I love you too, Cassian Ravenscroft. I did not expect to, when this marriage began, as nothing more than survival and necessity. But somewhere in these past weeks, watching you fix boathouse doors and defend tenant families, and confess old family secrets with more honesty than I had any right to expect, I fell in love with you rather completely." The kiss that followed was neither careful nor formal, none of the practiced distance that had marked every previous moment of tenderness between them. It was warm and certain, and carried within it every unspoken feeling both of them had carefully guarded through these past uncertain weeks, and when they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, Elena thought she had never felt so entirely, unexpectedly happy, storm still raging outside notwithstanding. They remained in the shelter of the tenant cottage, through the worst of the storm, Cassian's arm remaining wrapped protectively around her the entire time. And when they finally rode back toward Ravenscroft Hall the following morning, beneath a sky washed clean and bright by the storm's passing, Elena felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them, some final barrier finally dissolved. But happiness, as Elena had learned all too well these past weeks, rarely arrived unaccompanied by danger, and it was upon their return to the great house that Mrs. Pruitt met them at the door, with news that quickly stole the warmth from the morning entirely. "Your Grace, my lord," the housekeeper said, her face pale with worry. "A messenger arrived while you were away. Baron Thorne has filed his claim through the courts, formally and publicly, citing the timber rights and the outstanding gambling debts. He has also, I am afraid, made mention in the filed documents of certain family matters he claims bear relevance to the dispute, matters concerning your late father, my lord." Cassian's expression hardened at once, the warm openness of the morning, giving way to the familiar, controlled determination Elena had first witnessed the night his brother died. "He means to make the scandal public, regardless of Mrs. Marsh's willingness to speak the truth. It would seem so, my lord." Mrs. Pruitt wrung her hands anxiously. "The court date has been set for a fortnight hence, at the county seat. I am told half the county already speaks of little else." Elena felt her own happiness give way to a cold, familiar dread, though she reached for Cassian's hand nonetheless, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his fingers, threading through hers. "Then we shall face him at court, Cassian, together, exactly as we have faced everything else." Cassian looked down at her, and despite the trouble gathering in his eyes, something steady and certain remained there as well, the quiet confidence of a man who had finally allowed himself to love, and to be loved in return, whatever storms still lay ahead. "Together," he agreed firmly. "Whatever Thorne intends, Elena, he will find us rather less easily divided than he believes." The fortnight before the court date passed in a blur of careful preparation, Cassian and Elena, working alongside Mr. Aldridge, and a barrister brought in from London, to assemble the strongest possible defense against Thorne's claims. Mrs. Marsh, true to her word, agreed to testify if called upon, and her steady, dignified account of the old family history threatened to remove much of the scandal's power well before Thorne could wield it as he intended. But it was during these preparations that Elena, reviewing once more the old ledgers and documents they had gathered, noticed something that had escaped everyone's attention until now, a discrepancy in the dates surrounding the timber rights transfer that Mr. Grant had presented weeks before. "Cassian," she said, drawing his attention from his own work, late one evening, as they sat together in the study. "Look at this. The document transferring the timber rights to Thorne is dated the 4th of March. But this entry in the estate ledger, recording a payment from your brother to a physician in the nearby town, is dated the same day, and the physician's note describes treating your brother for a fever severe enough to leave him, in the physician's own words, barely capable of coherent speech." Cassian took the documents from her, his brow furrowing as he compared the dates carefully. If my brother was too ill to speak coherently on the 4th of March, how could he have signed away the timber rights that same day, with full understanding of the transaction? Perhaps he could not have, Elena said, her mind racing ahead to the implications. Perhaps the document was signed under circumstances that call its very legitimacy into question, either forged entirely, or signed while your brother was not of sound enough mind to understand what he agreed to. The discovery sent them immediately to the physician in question, an elderly man named Dr. Pemberton, who confirmed, with careful and precise medical recollection, that he had indeed treated Alistair Ravenscroft for a severe fever on the date in question, a fever that had left the young Duke delirious and barely conscious for the better part of 2 days. He could not possibly have understood any document placed before him that day, Dr. Pemberton said firmly, let alone signed it with the clear mind the law requires for such a transaction to hold legitimate weight. I would testify to this fact under oath, my lord, without hesitation. Armed with this new evidence, Cassian and Elena returned to Ravenscroft Hall with something they had not felt in weeks, genuine confidence that Thorne's claims might finally be successfully countered. But their satisfaction proved short-lived, for that same evening, a note arrived from an unexpected source, delivered by a young stable boy, who claimed a stranger had paid him to carry it to the great house. Cassian read the note in silence, his expression growing increasingly grim, before wordlessly passing it to Elena. It was unsigned, the handwriting hurried and uneven, but its message was clear enough. Your brother's fever was no accident. Ask Baron Thorne what he added to the wine he shared with the Duke that evening, and why the physician was not summoned until nearly a full day had passed. There is more to this than mere ill fortune. A friend who wishes to remain unnamed, for fear of what powerful men might do to those who speak against them. Cassian, Elena breathed, her heart pounding. You do not think. I do not know what to think, Cassian said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. But if there is any truth to this, if Thorne deliberately poisoned my brother, weakening him deliberately, in order to force through a fraudulent transaction, while he lay too ill to understand what he signed, then this goes far beyond mere financial scheming, Elena. This is something far more dangerous entirely. They brought the note to their barrister the following morning, who advised extreme caution, noting that an anonymous accusation, however alarming, would carry little weight in court without corroborating evidence. But the note's implications haunted Elena through the following days, and it was she who finally suggested they speak once more with the household staff who had served Alistair during that fateful illness, in case any of them recalled details that might support or refute the anonymous warning. It was a young footman named Peter, barely 18, and clearly nervous at being questioned by the new Duke and Duchess directly, who finally provided the crucial detail they had been searching for. I remember that evening well, Your Grace, Peter said, wringing his hands anxiously. Baron Thorne dined with the late Duke that night, and I served the wine myself. I remember thinking it strange, at the time, that the Baron insisted on pouring his own glass and the Duke's himself, rather than allowing me to perform the service as usual. He said something about a particular vintage requiring careful handling, and I thought nothing more of it at the time. But the Duke fell ill within the hour, and by morning, he was as the doctor described, barely conscious and unable to speak coherently. Why did no one summon the physician sooner? Cassian asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the fury Elena could see building behind his eyes. Baron Thorne insisted it was merely exhaustion, my lord, from the wine and a long evening of conversation, and that the Duke would recover with simple rest. He remained at the Duke's bedside himself through much of that first day, sending the rest of us away, saying he did not wish to trouble the household unnecessarily. It was only when the fever worsened considerably toward evening that Mrs. Pruitt insisted on summoning Dr. Pemberton herself, against the Baron's continued objections. The picture that emerged from Peter's careful, frightened testimony was damning indeed, suggesting a deliberate, calculated poisoning, designed not to kill Alistair outright, but to weaken him sufficiently that Thorne might force through the fraudulent timber rights transfer, while the Duke remained too ill to understand or resist. And if Thorne had been capable of such calculated cruelty toward Alistair, the same cold ruthlessness that had governed every move he had made against the family since, then the anonymous note's darker implication, that Alistair's eventual death might not have been entirely natural after all, could no longer be dismissed as mere suspicion. We must bring this to the court, Elena said firmly. Peter's testimony, combined with the physician's account and the dated discrepancy in the transfer documents, should be more than sufficient to expose Thorne's fraud, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, to raise the very questions about your brother's death that Thorn once tried to use as a threat against you. There is danger in this path, Elena, Cassian said carefully. If Thorn believes we mean to expose him so thoroughly, he may grow desperate, and desperate men are rarely predictable in what lengths they might go to protect themselves. I am aware of the danger. Elena met his eyes steadily, drawing on the same courage that had carried her through the storm, through the frightened crossing of the rising stream, through every difficult moment of these past weeks. But I would rather face that danger directly, Cassian, than allow a man like Thorn to continue circling this family, taking whatever he pleases through fraud and fear, simply because we were too cautious to confront him fully. Cassian studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his careful eyes, before he drew her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead with a tenderness that belied the danger gathering around them. I begin to think, Elena, that I chose rather better than I knew, when circumstance first forced this marriage upon us. They spent the remaining days before the court date, gathering every piece of corroborating evidence they could find. Peter's testimony formally recorded by their barrister, Dr. Pemberton's account carefully documented, Mrs. Marsh prepared to speak the truth about the family's old scandal, should Thorn attempt to raise it publicly. And through it all, Elena felt the fragile happiness she had found with Cassian these past weeks, growing steadily stronger, tempered but not diminished by the danger still gathering around them, as though the very act of facing this threat together had only deepened the bond between them. But neither of them knew, as they made their final preparations for the approaching court date, just how far Baron Thorn was truly prepared to go to protect his schemes, nor how close the danger still circling Ravenscroft Hall would soon come to threatening not merely their fortune, but their very lives. The morning of the court date arrived cold and clear, a stark contrast to the storm that had swept through weeks before, and Elena dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue, feeling as though she were preparing for battle rather than a legal proceeding. Cassian waited for her in the great hall, dressed in his finest dark coat, his expression carrying the same careful, controlled determination she had first seen the night his brother died, though now she understood the depths of feeling that composure concealed, rather than fearing it as she once had. "Are you ready?" he asked, taking her hand as they prepared to depart for the county seat. "As ready as I will ever be," Elena replied, drawing strength from the warm certainty of his grip. "Whatever Thorn intends to say today, Cassian, we face it together." The county courthouse was crowded well beyond its usual capacity, word of the dispute between the new Duke of Ravenscroft and the wealthy Baron Thorn having spread through the county with the speed only genuine scandal could achieve. Elena felt the weight of countless curious eyes upon them as they took their seats, but she held her chin high, refusing to let the whispered speculation shake her composure. Baron Thorn arrived shortly after, dressed in immaculate finery, his smooth smile firmly in place as he greeted acquaintances among the gathered crowd with practiced charm. He caught Elena's eye briefly as he took his own seat, and something in his expression, a flicker of confidence bordering on arrogance, told her he believed himself still firmly in control of the proceedings ahead. The case began with Thorn's own barrister presenting the claim regarding the timber rights, citing the signed transfer document as clear and binding evidence of legitimate transaction. Elena watched Cassian's jaw tighten as the barrister spoke, but he remained outwardly composed, waiting patiently for their own counsel to present the evidence they had gathered. When their turn came, their barrister rose with quiet, methodical confidence, presenting first the physician's testimony regarding Alistair's severe illness, on the very date the transfer document claimed to have been signed, with full understanding and legal capacity. A murmur moved through the gathered crowd as Dr. Pemberton took the stand himself, confirming under oath that the late Duke had been entirely incapable of coherent thought or legal decision-making on the day in question. Thorn's composed expression flickered for the first time, a shadow of genuine concern crossing his features before he mastered it once more. Their barrister continued, presenting next the testimony of young Peter, the footman, who had witnessed Thorn personally pouring the wine that had preceded Alistair's sudden and severe illness, and who described in careful, frightened detail how the Baron had discouraged the household from summoning proper medical attention through much of that critical first day. "My lord," Thorn's barrister objected sharply, "this is nothing more than the unfounded speculation of a servant boy, hardly evidence of any wrongdoing on my client's part." "Perhaps," their own barrister replied calmly, "but combined with the dated discrepancy in the transfer document, and the physician's confirmed testimony regarding the Duke's incapacity that same day, it raises questions this court cannot reasonably ignore regarding the legitimacy of the timber rights transfer, and indeed, regarding the full circumstances surrounding the late Duke's declining health in the months before his eventual death. The courtroom erupted into fervent whispers at this direct implication, and Elena watched Baron Thorne's composure crack further, his smooth confidence giving way to something harder and more dangerous beneath the surface. He leaned close to his own barrister, speaking in urgent, hushed tones, before rising suddenly to his feet. "My lord," Thorne addressed the presiding magistrate directly, his voice carrying an edge of desperation beneath its careful control. "I believe these accusations, however dramatically presented, distract entirely from the matter at hand. Whatever occurred regarding the late Duke's health is a private family matter, unrelated to the clear and legal transfer of timber rights that stands recorded and witnessed. I would ask the court to focus on the documents before it, rather than the unfounded speculation of frightened servants and grieving widows seeking any excuse to avoid honoring legitimate debts." "Grieving widow," Elena repeated softly, rising to her own feet before Cassian could stop her, a fierce certainty settling over her that she would not sit silently while Thorne attempted to dismiss the truth as mere hysterical speculation. "Baron Thorne calls me a grieving widow seeking excuses. My lord, when it was he himself who suggested, weeks past, that questions might arise regarding the circumstances of my late husband's death, should his claims against this family be disputed. I wonder now whether that suggestion was not merely a threat, but a confession disguised as intimidation." The courtroom fell into stunned silence at her bold accusation, and Elena saw something flicker dangerously behind Thorne's carefully composed features, a flash of genuine fury quickly masked once more. "Your Grace," the presiding magistrate said carefully, "these are serious allegations. Do you have further evidence to support such a claim?" It was Cassian who rose then, standing beside Elena, with quiet, fierce pride, evident in every line of his posture. "My lord, we have presented evidence sufficient to raise legitimate doubt regarding the legality of the timber rights transfer. Evidence that stands entirely apart from the family matter Baron Thorne wishes this court to believe is somehow relevant to his defense. We ask only that the court weigh the evidence presented fairly, and determine accordingly whether a document signed by a man too ill to understand its contents can truly be considered a legitimate legal transaction." The magistrate considered this for a long moment, the courtroom holding its collective breath, before finally speaking. "The court finds the evidence presented regarding the circumstances of the transfer's signing sufficiently compelling to warrant further investigation before any ruling can be made regarding its legitimacy. This matter will be adjourned, pending a full formal inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the late Duke of Ravenscroft's illness and the timing of the disputed document's signing." It was not the immediate, decisive victory Elena had hoped for, but it was, she understood, a significant blow to Thorne's confidence and his scheme, buying them crucial time while removing the immediate threat of the timber rights claim succeeding unchallenged. She watched Thorne's expression as the magistrate's ruling settled over the courtroom, and saw beneath his forced, careful composure something that looked distinctly like a man realizing his careful plans were beginning to unravel entirely. As the crowd began to disperse following the adjournment, Thorne approached them directly, his smooth mask slipping further with every step, revealing more clearly than ever before the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his charming exterior. "You believe you have won something today," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge beneath its careful control. "You have only delayed the inevitable, Your Grace. I have resources and patience you cannot begin to match, and I do not intend to lose everything I have worked toward, because a footman's frightened testimony and a physician's convenient timing have raised a few doubts in a country magistrate's mind." "Then perhaps," Cassian said, stepping protectively closer to Elena, his voice carrying a cold fury Elena had never heard from him before, "you should consider, Baron Thorne, whether the resources and patience you speak of are truly worth the risk of a formal inquiry into my brother's death. If you did indeed poison him, however unintentionally severe the consequences, that is no longer merely a civil dispute over disputed property. That is a matter for criminal justice, and I promise you, I will pursue it to its fullest extent, whatever it costs either of us." Something dangerous flashed behind Thorne's eyes at the direct accusation, his careful mask falling away entirely for one brief, revealing moment, and Elena saw, with a chill of genuine fear, the true ruthlessness that had always lurked beneath his smooth, charming exterior. "You have made a grave error, Ravenscroft," Thorne said quietly, his voice stripped of all pretense now, "in believing that a formal inquiry frightens me more than the alternative. I would remind you, and your clever wife, that accidents happen far too easily to those who press dangerous men toward desperate corners." He straightened his coat with careful precision, his composure reasserting itself like a mask sliding back into place. "I bid you good day, Your Grace, Your Grace. I imagine we shall speak again, before this matter is fully resolved." He departed the courthouse with the same smooth confidence he had arrived with, though Elena thought she saw, beneath the careful performance, a man now genuinely rattled by how close their evidence had come to exposing him entirely. She turned to Cassian, her heart still pounding from the direct threat Thorne had leveled against them. "He threatened us," she said quietly, directly, without even the pretense of subtlety he maintained before. "I heard him." Cassian's expression had gone hard and dangerous, the same controlled fury she had witnessed the night his brother died, though now she understood it not as coldness, but as a man determined to protect what he loved at any cost. "We must be careful, Elena, more careful than we have been. A man cornered as thoroughly as Thorne now finds himself is a man capable of far greater desperation than mere legal maneuvering." They returned to Ravenscroft Hall that evening, with the formal inquiry now set in motion, and a genuine sense of progress achieved, however incomplete. But Thorne's parting threat echoed uneasily through Elena's thoughts, as the carriage carried them home through the gathering dusk, and she found herself watching the shadows along the estate's long drive, with a wariness she had not felt since the earliest, most frightening days of this entire ordeal, uncertain what desperate measures a cornered and ruthless man might yet attempt before this dangerous game between them finally reached its end. 3 nights after the court hearing, Elena woke suddenly from a restless sleep, certain she had heard something moving in the corridor outside the Duchess's chamber. Cassian stirred beside her, instantly alert, the careful wariness they had both carried since Thorne's parting threat, never far from the surface even in sleep. "Stay here," he whispered, rising quietly, and reaching for the heavy candlestick beside the bed, the closest weapon at hand. "I will not stay here while you investigate alone," Elena whispered back, already reaching for her own robe. "Not after everything Thorne threatened." They moved together through the darkened corridor, and it was Elena who first noticed the faint smell of smoke drifting from the direction of the estate office, where the crucial evidence Cassian had gathered for the formal inquiry remained locked away. "Fire," she breathed, and they broke into a run together, reaching the office to find flames already climbing the heavy curtains near the window, clearly set deliberately, the evidence of forced entry visible in the broken lock and scattered papers near the overturned desk. "The evidence," Cassian said grimly, already working to smother the flames with a nearby rug while shouting for the household to wake and bring water. "He means to destroy what we have gathered before the formal inquiry can proceed." Between Cassian's quick action and the household staff's rapid response, the fire was contained before it could spread beyond the office itself, though considerable damage had been done to the room, and several documents had been lost entirely to the flames. As dawn broke gray and cold over Ravenscroft Hall, Cassian and Elena stood surveying the damage, both of them exhausted and shaken by how close the danger had truly come. "He is more desperate than we realized," Elena said quietly, examining the scorched remains of what had once been careful, methodical evidence against Thorne's schemes. "Or more frightened," Cassian replied, his expression grim but determined. "A man does not resort to arson unless he believes the alternative, exposure and formal justice, poses a far greater threat to him than the crime of destroying evidence ever could." It was Mrs. Pruitt, arriving breathlessly with news from the village, who provided the crucial piece that finally brought the entire dangerous affair to its resolution. A stable hand from Thorne's own estate, frightened by what he had witnessed and unwilling to remain silent any longer given the escalating danger, had come forward to the local magistrate that very morning, confessing that he had been paid handsomely by the Baron himself to set the fire at Ravenscroft Hall, and further confessing his knowledge that Thorne had, indeed, added a substance to Alistair's wine months before, intending only to weaken the Duke sufficiently to force through the fraudulent document, never intending, or so the stable hand claimed Thorne had insisted, for the poison to prove fatal, weeks later, when the Duke's weakened heart finally gave out entirely. The revelation, once formally reported and corroborated by the household staff's own testimony regarding that fateful evening and Alistair's subsequent decline, transformed the entire nature of the proceedings against Baron Thorn, elevating the matter from a civil dispute over property into a full criminal investigation regarding the circumstances of Alistair's death itself. Thorn, learning of the stable hand's confession and the magistrate's subsequent order for his arrest, attempted to flee the county entirely, but was apprehended at the county's northern border by constables alerted to his likely escape route, his carriage found laden with valuables and documents he had clearly intended to use to establish himself elsewhere under a different identity, far from the consequences of his schemes. The trial that followed, held some weeks later, once the formal investigation had concluded, drew even greater crowds than the original civil hearing, the entire county eager to witness the fall of a man who had, for years, wielded considerable influence and charm to disguise the ruthless cruelty beneath his polished exterior. Elena and Cassian attended together, standing united through every difficult moment of testimony, watching as the careful mask Thorn had maintained for so long finally crumbled entirely under the weight of evidence and confession, revealing at last the desperate, calculating man who had never truly cared for anyone or anything beyond his own advancement and fortune. The verdict, when it finally came, brought a measure of justice Elena had not been entirely certain they would ever achieve. Thorn convicted of fraud, arson, and the poisoning that had contributed, if not directly caused, Alistair's eventual death, sentenced to transportation for the remainder of his natural life, his considerable fortune and holdings seized to help settle the very debts he had once used as leverage against the Ravenscroft family. As they left the courthouse for the final time, the late autumn sun breaking warm and golden through clouds that had finally cleared after weeks of uncertainty and danger, Cassian turned to Elena, with an expression she had not seen from him since the earliest, most guarded days of their acquaintance, finally softening entirely into something unreserved and genuinely joyful. "It is over," he said quietly, as though he could scarcely believe the words himself. "Thorn can no longer threaten this family, Elena. The estate is secure. My brother's memory, whatever his failings, need no longer be shadowed by suspicion or scandal." "It is over," Elena agreed, reaching for his hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers, threading through hers, with the same natural certainty that had grown between them through every difficult moment of these past months. "And we faced it together, exactly as we promised we would." They returned to Ravenscroft Hall that evening to find the household staff had prepared a quiet celebration, candles lit throughout the great hall, a warmth and lightness filling the old stone house that Elena had not felt since before Alistair's death had first cast its long shadow over everything. Her mother and father had traveled from the village to join them, her mother weeping openly with relief and genuine happiness this time, rather than the anxious tears that had marked so much of these difficult past months. Later that evening, once the small celebration had wound down and the household had settled into peaceful quiet, Elena found herself once more on the terrace, overlooking the ornamental lake, the same place where Cassian had first spoken her given name beneath the moonlight, all those months before. He joined her there now, wrapping his coat gently around her shoulders against the cool evening air, his arms settling naturally around her waist, as they stood together watching the moon's reflection ripple across the peaceful water. "I have been thinking," Cassian said softly, "about the wedding night we never truly had, Elena. The one Thorn's schemes, and my brother's death, and every danger since first delayed, and then complicated, and then very nearly cost us both our lives entirely. I have thought of it too," Elena admitted, leaning back gratefully into the warmth of his embrace. "Though I confess, Cassian, that whatever we lost in that first uncertain wedding night, I would not trade the journey that brought us here, difficult as it was, for anything less than exactly what we have found together. Nor would I." Cassian turned her gently to face him, his winter sea eyes now warm with a depth of feeling Elena had once believed him incapable of, before she had come to know the honest, gentle heart hidden so carefully beneath his controlled exterior. "You came into this family as a bride widowed before her wedding night had truly begun. Elena, claimed by circumstance and necessity, into a marriage neither of us chose freely at first. But I find myself now, standing here with you, beneath this same moon, that once witnessed my first honest confession, wanting nothing more than to claim you again, truly and completely, not out of necessity or practicality, but simply because I love you more fully than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone. Elena felt tears gather in her eyes, warm and grateful rather than sorrowful, as she reached up to cradle his face in her hands. Then claim me, Cassian Ravenscroft, not as the ruthless Duke's brother who once frightened me in a darkened study, but as the man who fixed boathouse doors with his own hands, who confessed his grief honestly when I asked it of him, who held me steady through a rising flood and told me I was safe, and who has shown me, through every difficult moment of these past months, what it truly means to be loved completely and honestly. Their kiss beneath the moonlight carried none of the uncertainty or careful distance that had once defined every moment between them, only the full, unguarded warmth of two people who had faced danger and grief and uncertainty together, and had emerged from it not merely surviving, but genuinely, deeply in love. When they finally made their way back into the house together, hand in hand, the great stone walls of Ravenscroft Hall no longer felt to Elena like a place of shadows and secrets, but simply, finally, like home. The wedding night that had been stolen from her months before, on that first terrible evening when she had found herself a widow before she had ever truly been a wife, was given back to her at last, not through the ruthless claiming she had once feared from Alistair's cold, calculating brother, but through the genuine, hard-won love of a man who had proven himself, through every trial they had faced together, worthy of every trust and every tenderness she had to offer. Outside, the moon continued its slow, peaceful arc across a clear autumn sky, and somewhere in the quiet grounds below, the boathouse door that Cassian had once mended with his own careful hands stood steady and true against whatever storms might yet come, much like the love that had grown, against every expectation, between a grieving widow and the Duke's once ruthless brother, now finally, completely, claimed by nothing more dangerous than each other's hearts.